Before we begin with the main argument of this video, discussing the philosopher Jason Jorjani's philosophical project of Prometheism, let us remind ourselves where we left off regarding Hesiod. In our previous video, we mentioned the possibility that Hesiod's Works and Days is a work that is expressing what is known as blame poetry, and we argued that although there are strong elements of irony and satire present throughout the work, we believe that there is a deeper meaning that Hesiod is hoping for us to penetrate. I would say that not only does the human world, according to Hesiod, present two types of strife, the motivating good kind and the purely destructive bad, which he introduces near the beginning of the Works and Days, but that the framing by which the poem is itself composed is an exercise of these two forms of strife, whereby the bad strife of his brother Perseus allows for the emergence and unfoldment of the good strife, the kind that Hesiod advocates. As we have mentioned previously, the good strife is somehow dependent on the bad strife. It is through negative exemplars that we can somehow come to the truth, or a right ordering and orientation toward our life and daily activities. By orienting ourselves properly, we are thereby maintaining and preserving the cosmos. Similarly, in the theology, we find two fundamental genealogies. From chaos emerges Erebus, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, and Nux. But as the cosmological architecture of the theogony unfolds, it becomes evident that chaos births its own children in parallel opposition to Gaia's line of descendants. What we essentially have here are two genealogical lines of progression, one arising from chaos and one from Gaia. At various points throughout the poem, the conflict erupts between the children of chaos and the children of Gaia, and it is in and through this conflict that certain relationships are observed, and a semblance of ambiguous order is established, until at last fully consolidating under the reign of Zeus. We can see this happening on a small human scale, where the unbounded and hubristic are those who know no proper limits and proper order, exemplified by Perseus and the worldly kings, who Hesiod uses as foils to establish what is in fact justice. As for Perseus, quote, "You give heed to justice and do not foster outrageousness, for outrageousness is evil in a worthless mortal, and even a fine man cannot bear her easily, but encounters calamities and then is weighed down under her. The better road is the one toward what is just, passing her by on the other side. Justice wins out over outrageousness when she arrives at the end, but the fool only knows this after he has suffered." This, quote, outrageousness is the Loeb translation of the word hubris, which has the connotation of an act of violence directed towards the order of Zeus, as opposed to the definition commonly held, which is simply seen as a psychological sense of pride. This violence against order can be seen by one of the first children of chaos, Nux or night, who herself gives birth to Moros, doom or destiny, Ker, destruction, Thanatos, death, Oizus, pain or distress, and many more, including Eris or strife. Collectively, we can see these offspring not so much as divine persons in and of themselves, but manifestations of forces that bring about the instability that always pursues the cosmos and therefore requires constant vigilance and maintenance to keep at bay. The word outrageous emerges again when Typhon is produced from Hera. Hesiod describes it as, quote, "terrible, outrageous, and lawless." As we've noted, these are qualities opposed to Zeus's reign, who finally defeats this creature in order to consolidate his dominion over the cosmos. Again, we see that Perseus is embodying those outrageous, lawless forces, and Hesiod is directing us toward the path of reconstituting order under the supreme aegis of Zeus. The classicist Hugh Lloyd-Jones observed that earlier scholars had detected a shift in emotional perception of the world when the epic age moved into the lyric. These scholars believed that there was a literal shift in the existential condition of the ancients, as feelings of amekania, or human helplessness, seemingly increased, moving from the 8th to the 7th centuries BCE. Of course, Lloyd-Jones is quick to put this issue to rest, since the nature of lyric poetry itself was more personal and concerned with the inner life of the poet, and would naturally express more vulnerable human emotions as opposed to epic poetry. There is no need to insist on such a radical shift. However, what I am noticing in the contemporary world is an increased sense of helplessness and existential despair, which diverse people combat in incredibly diverse ways. Some seek self-destructive behavior to escape from their pain through drug abuse or alcohol. Some advocate for nihilism, others a progressive utopianism, while many have returned to some form of spiritual and religious tradition. There is a philosophical movement I would like to focus on in this video, perhaps best represented by the work of Jorjani, who seeks to valorize the Promethean Titan and advocate for an emulation of his powers, in order to engage with and prepare for humanity's present and future trials. This philosophical project seeks to express an extroverted position by grabbing hold of the reins of human self-determination. It takes a fundamentally Nietzschean approach to the overman, to wrest control from the gods and titans and fashion man anew, and somehow overcome this dichotomy of conflictual forces that the latter two entities represent. But this too strikes me as a reaction to the sense of helplessness that characterizes many people along the spiritual path who yearn for a way out of this nihilism and seek meaning. As Jorjani summarizes his philosophy's object, quote, "The point is to foster human evolution and social development forward into the future based on the purposes that we as a people define for ourselves." For all this talk of heroism and warrior ethos exemplified by many so-called pagan Nietzschean YouTubers, there is a distinct sense of insecurity that underlies so many of these philosophical postures. Jorjani is preoccupied with the notions of the determinism of fate and its implications for free will, and construes the Olympian sovereignty over the cosmos as implicitly hierarchical and therefore oppressive. It is important to keep in mind the words of E.R. Dodds when he said, quote, "Yet, for all that, Homer's princes bestride their world boldly. They fear their gods only as they fear their human overlords, nor are they oppressed by the future, even when, like Achilles, they know that it holds an approaching doom." In a recent interview, Jorjani briefly summarizes his Promethean project, quote, "I am not saying that we should become gods. I'm not even saying we should become titans. One of the reasons why the myth of Prometheus has become central to my work is that Prometheus is a titan who betrayed the titans to help Zeus, only to then turn on Zeus to be a benefactor of humanity. So Prometheus defies this dichotomy between gods and titans. The purpose of adopting a Promethean worldview is not to become like the Olympian gods for sure, but it's also not to identify with the titans. The point is to foster human evolution and social development forward into the future based on the purpose that we as a people define for ourselves. Let us ignore for the present the troubles of this utopian vision of humanity transcending good and evil and the human condition altogether, never minding the fact that this so-called democratic instinct of, quote, we as a people defining values for ourselves has never held much power given elite theory and the manner in which political power is distributed in a world such as ours. Let's make some theological points of clarification. When Jorjani speaks of not becoming, quote, like the Olympian gods, if we take that sentence at face value, it seems to be conveying a truth, in the sense that the art of theurgy is never to become the gods pure and simple, but to approximate their movements and therefore their patterns of power in the cosmos. So in this sense, theurgy is about becoming like the gods. As Gregory Shaw states, quote, "The okema for Iamblichus is an immortal body through which we receive and express the nous and become homologous to the entire cosmos." This nous, variously translated as mind or consciousness, is precisely that of Zeus, one of his most important attributes. It indicates that his reign is governed by intelligence and persuasion first and foremost, rather than brute force. refuting those like Jorjani who would see in Zeus the embodiment of a tyrant, imposing his suffocating will onto the cosmos. Unfortunately for Nietzscheans, there is no path that the human can take without participating in the gods. It's not even comprehensible to act outside the cosmos or to sever our ties with either the Olympians or the Titans, for there is a strange way in which we participate and are comprised of a confluence of these powers. Prometheism is a project that is doomed from the start, for in order to embody it already assumes a distance from the very structure of the cosmos itself, in which we are already embedded. This exemplifies the absolute danger in misinterpreting myths, especially construing them to assert our own particular philosophical and political agendas. No one, however, is immune to this, and no interpretation is the final, definitive statement on a myth, because by its very nature, myths, which are expressions of real dynamic relations between the gods at the level of the soul, evade concrete determinations. But this is not to say that any and all interpretation is legitimate, for there are more sympathetic readings that would approximate the nature of the cosmos itself, which is synchronous rather than asynchronous and disjointed. After all, when you walk outside to your local store, you do not feel yourself running the risk of a vast chasm opening up beneath your feet and sending you off into the void. The cosmic order inspires a certain level of trust, so that we do not have such fears. There is no metaphysical station that the human soul can take that would exceed or make inconsequential the powers of the Titans or the gods. But Jorjani is adding here another caution, which is that we are also not, quote, to identify with the Titans either, so that humans are to embody the archetype of Prometheus, who positions himself in between the Titans and the gods, the Titan who works as the main benefactor of the human race. In fact, some myths present Prometheus as the creator of humanity from clay. Jorjani seems to be suggesting that humanity can and emphatically must transcend this dual conflict between the reactive Titans and the oppressive Olympians. In my opinion, this would effectively destroy the need for any sort of theology or participation with the gods. In my view, this theoretical third position that humanity would place itself in would seek to cut itself off not only from the powers which make life possible for humans, but also the entire constitution of the cosmos. This notion is about as absurd as post-theism. Again, we are seeing the dangerous eruption of transhumanist ideology undergirding much theological exegesis. And when you've transcended the God, you must, after all, put something else in its place and make it a new God. After all, what is the point of establishing worship, which is fundamentally the establishment of a relationship between a human and a God, if there is no God there on the receiving end? Or if what you are seeking is to transcend the God's own individuality altogether, and somehow operating in some acosmic space that falls into non-differentiation. Jason Jorjani also seems to echo the notion of a cynical Plato, one who utilizes the noble lie to fabricate a religion for the masses, without, of course, truly believing in it himself. In a video scoffing the piety of Plato, he says, quote, "The Greek gods are all over the texts of Plato, and yet clearly Plato is not advocating faith in the Olympian pantheon. In fact, what Plato is doing is attempting to shatter the naive, customary, Homeric conventions of his society." A statement such as this is incredibly irresponsible. It is not in fact as clear as Jorjani seems to suggest. In the 2013 academic monograph entitled Plato's Gods by Gerd von Rayl, he states, quote, "The evidence that Plato shows genuine respect to the traditional gods is overwhelming. Ekaterina Levka has been investigating the numeric features of the mentions of different traditional gods, and the results are undeniable. The gods are mentioned in all the works of Plato, in all sorts of contexts, discussing the cosmos, the city, human nature, or everyday activities. from occasional invocations over pledges of worship through descriptions of their nature. The context is mostly not ironic or meant to put things in perspective. The gods are inscribed in Plato's societal and educational project, and certainly not as mere adornment or metaphor. As Daniel Babbitt puts it, one would be tempted to say, parodying Plato's words, that the Olympians were not just useful to him from a societal, educative, or legislative viewpoint, as they are the indispensable ground for the religion of the city, but that Plato still envisages them as true, whereby the two criteria, the theological and the utilitarian, meet again. There's so much in these discussions that state legitimate historical and even philosophical facts with interjections of absolute conjectural thinking that does violence to the facts on the ground. The problem often is not the hard facts or the texts themselves, for example, but their extrapolation and very modernist and presentist interpretations. But this would also appear to be in line with the greater Promethean project that would seek to detect a hidden, occulted grand narrative that underlies myths across different regions and cultures, never mind the unintegrated and slapdash manner by which comparative religions are studied online. It would probably take several months to counter-argue and put into perspective everything that is confidently claimed in a 2-hour YouTube video. It is like the scholarly version of whack-a-mole. Rather than embracing a third path of self-determination, I would suggest that the logic of Prometheism would result in the human simply falling into the category of the titanic. For as Damascius says, quote, "It is better to acknowledge its existence everywhere, since in any case at its source there are gods, the titans. Then also on the plane of rational life, this apparent self-determination, which seems to aim at belonging to itself alone, and neither to the superior nor the inferior, is wrought in us by the titans. Through it we tear asunder the Dionysus in ourselves, breaking up the natural continuity of our being and our partnership, so to speak, with the superior and the inferior. While in this condition we are titans. But when we recover that lost unity, we become Dionysus, and we attain what can truly be called completeness." It is strange to hear these remarks coming from Jorjani, who admires the works of Heraclitus, but who cannot sense the communion between gods and men and gods in his famous saying, "Mortals are immortals, and immortals are mortals. The one living, the other's is death, and dying, the other's is life." This fragment is of course not saying that the gods and mortal beings are literally the same, but that there is an interpenetration and exchange that is indeed occurring, despite their ontological separation. And one of the firmest ways of establishing a relationship with a god is through worship and sacrifice. We know that Heraclitus was critical of blood sacrifice, but this does not preclude sacrifice on a more symbolic and abstracted level. As Pausanias makes clear, once upon a time in the golden age of Kronos' reign, men and gods dined together at the same table. Quote, "For the men of those days, because of their righteousness and piety, were guest friends and the table companions, eating at the same board. The good were openly honored by the gods, and the unjust were openly visited with their wrath." Dining together in ancient cultures and in many traditions in the contemporary world is a symbolic event, but also one that establishes relationships of kinship. To quote Almquist, quote, "Kinship among strangers may sound like a paradoxical idea. However, as Marshall Salins has recently argued, kinship entails far more than blood. Kinship concerns, quote, mutuality of being, and, quote, kinfolk are persons who participate intrinsically in each other's existence. They are members of one another." We made an earlier video of the paradoxes of the reign of Kronos, at once the peaceful king of the Golden Age and simultaneously the devouring tyrant par excellence. But this paradoxical nature of his reign is not a bug, but a feature. In fact, the communion of the feast between mortals and the gods is just another expression of his reign's uncertain ambiguity and instability. Versnell also notes the presence of monsters and other hybrid creatures living in the reign of Kronos. Quote, "Primeval chaos manifests itself as a temporary elimination of all contours, a return to a state undefined by bounds and moral standards, expressing itself in the creation of monsters and monstrosities, a period of total freedom manifesting itself in both total lawlessness and total abundance." This abundance enjoyed by the race of men in the age of Kronos is described in the Works and Days as follows, quote, "They had all good things. The grain-giving field bore crops of its own accord." This is found in line 117. "Automate polon te kai aphthonon." Note the word relating to our word automatic, the meaning of which approximates something that is, quote, self-willed, being a divine nature itself. As we have just shown, the grain-giving field who, quote, bore crops of its own accord was part of a feast consumed by the humans who lived and feasted with the gods in the reign of Kronos. But the gods themselves do not consume these foods. Instead, they consume nectar and ambrosia, ambrosia translating itself as not mortal, and nectar having an interpretation of, quote, getting across death. There is a deep association here, therefore, between the food that is consumed and the essence of one's being, since, as Almquist states, quote, "For early poets, food is something that creates flesh, separating those who eat apart and unites those who eat together." As products of clay, or in other myths, as the generated offspring of the Melian tree nymphs, there is an underlying notion that humans are created by the gods. Hesiod leaves a certain ambiguity and does not come definitively on one position or another, since the birth of the Melian tree nymphs was also a result of the bloodshed of Uranus. But a close reading has shown that Hesiod indeed saw the two races, the mortal and the immortal, as distinct. Being fashioned from clay also implies our malleability and hence our passivity. In comparison with the superabundant activity of the gods, the human is inherently passive. It is only in the most extreme bounds of energic expenditure, for example, in the violent wrath of Achilles, that a mortal frame can even approach the lowest level of the activity expressed by a god. This can also be seen in the nature of the foods they consumed during the feast. To summarize, humans and gods are ontologically distinct, but once upon a time shared a certain kinship to one another, until that fateful episode in Mekone with Prometheus. Unfortunately, many philosophers and classicists have read many of these myths and interpret them based on their literal telling, as if myths simply convey a linear narrative sequence. But this is fundamentally to misunderstand the nature of myth, especially a misunderstanding of the structure of the theogony. Jason Jorjani is operating on a fundamental misapprehension of the Promethean episode at Mekone and what this entails for the establishment of the cosmos we currently inhabit. I quote Jorjani, as he says, the Titans, quote, "are beings who are hell-bent on vengeance and their entire raison d'etre is to go to war with the Olympians." Yes, this is true on the exoteric reading of the theogony. But if we observe more closely, and as we discussed in the beginning of this video, cosmic conflict is the means by which generation and procession is brought about. Here is a lengthy quote from Edward Butler on the nature of conflict in the theogony and how it allows for the generation of being. Quote, "Each of the pairs of gods depicted in the poem as being in conflict thus form between them a field of oppositions that form a matrix for generation or coming to be. Their conflict is thus no mere strife arising from motives that would make no sense to ascribe to gods, but rather a symbol for their cooperation in producing things for which certain kinds of conflicting forces are integral to their nature. Things, in other words, the unity of which is looser and held together by these polarities, in accord with a basic imperative to maximize the kinds of being that are able to manifest, to the utmost limits of what can be unified at all. This is what it means for the gods to want everything to become as much like themselves as possible, and to let anyone who wishes to follow them as far as they can, namely to extend unity, individuation, to as many things of as many different kinds as possible, including things for which certain kinds of conflict is constitutive of the unity they are capable of possessing. In line with Jorjani's statement in the beginning of another video of Gnostic Informant, we can see him comparing the outward appearance of strife in the cosmos, while demonstrating that behind appearances there is a certain, quote, hidden or occulted harmony. It is precisely this hidden or occulted harmony, I would argue, that calls into question his interpretation of the figure of Prometheus. As he himself characterizes it, the Prometheus expressed by Jorjani is similar to the Luciferian principle, the bringer of light. Those whom the English and German romantics like Byron and Goethe praised as the defender of humanity against the supposedly arbitrary and unlawful exercise of power by the tyrannical Zeus. Outwardly, yes, Prometheus seems to be a figure of romantic rebellion against tyranny, but esoterically speaking, this conflict he engages in with Zeus actually brings about the full consolidation of Zeus's reign. Most important to note is that there is no real deception or trickery by Prometheus, since line 550 to 551 says, "So he spoke, plotting deception. But Zeus, who knows eternal counsels, recognized the deception and did not fail to perceive it." Prometheus also provides Zeus with the free will to choose between the divided portions, and Zeus chooses what is most befitting the gods, the abstracted aroma and therefore the spiritualized essence of the sacrifice, and not the material portion of the meat itself. The irony is that Prometheus is instrumental in ensuring that humans remain forced to consume not, quote, automatic grain that is in proximity with the gods' food, like they had done in the realm of Kronos, but meats and foodstuffs that provide us with only ephemeral and fleeting energy replenishment, condemning us to a world where we must hunt and work and strive after our daily nourishment. Effectively, it consolidated our mortality. Alchemist notes that the Latin word decido, from which our word decide originates, literally translates as to cut off. The Greek equivalent is krino, which entails a deciding, judging, or, quote, the act of dividing itself. There is a sense in which this deciding can also refer to the act of apportioning. Hence, the division between mortals and immortals during the sacrifice is simultaneously a cosmic event where the fates to each are being apportioned. He observes that at line 520 of the Theogony, Zeus apportions Atlas the responsibility for holding up the sky, quote, "For this is the portion which the counselor Zeus assigned him. Tauten gar hoi moiran, edesapto mitieta Zeus." For this, we can see that Zeus is already apportioning divisions or moirai when Prometheus divides the ox. Zeus exclaims, quote, "Son of Iapetus, eminent among all rulers, my fine fellow, how unfairly you have divided up the portions," with the same word appearing again in the aorist middle, diedasao moiras. Therefore, there is a strong connection between Zeus's divisions and apportionments to the other titans and gods in the cosmos, which is already in fact occurring, and the divisions of Prometheus and the sacrifice of the ox. It has always surprised me that we can speak of Prometheus as having his name derived from pronoia, or forethought, something that Iamblichus established etymologically, but somehow we countenance the idea that he could have been mistaken in believing that he had the ability to deceive Zeus. What has been argued by Almquist and others is that the fateful episode in Mycone with Prometheus dividing the portions of the ox and, quote, deceiving Zeus, not only separated and distinguished the potentially dangerous humans, who are indeed mixed with titanic blood, but also was the site, quote, where Zeus organized the cosmos as a whole. There, Prometheus is, in my opinion, the agent of Zeus, whether knowingly or unknowingly. I would incline to the former, since Prometheus has forethought. The divisions that Zeus is already undergoing are echoed by Prometheus, and by dividing the sacrifice and separating one portion for the gods and the other for mortals, Prometheus is effectively establishing distance from the Olympian gods, but also separating man from his own titanic nature, firmly establishing us within a distinct ontological hierarchy, where we are equally distanced and divided from our internal titanic natures and our external kinship relationships with the gods, opening up thereby a possibility for free choice to either descend and give way to our material titanic impulses, or to establish proper relations with the ordering structures and powers that innervate our cosmos through the gods. Prometheus is loyal to Zeus, in the sense that he was seen by the Neoplatonists as the principle of procession. Quote, Prometheus reveals the ways in which the gods proceed down into nature. Epimetheus, the modes of their reversion to the intelligible plane. Iamblichus is stated to have said so on the authority of Pythagoras. As an interesting side note, Damascius says, quote, Plato, in the Protagoras, makes Prometheus superior to Epimetheus, in imitation of his Aeneid. The Pythagoreans, however, seem to rank Epimetheus higher. This, I think, can be inferred from the fact that they associate Prometheus with procession, Epimetheus with reversion, hence the higher evaluation, for it is better for souls to revert from Genesis than to go forth into it. In order to look at the consequences of Prometheus's division for the human and the cosmos at large, it is important to set the theogony and the works and days side by side and make a structural comparison. As we can see from this image, the theogony is comprised of 1,022 lines, and the division at Mycone begins at line 535, just after the middle of the text, with Prometheus uttering his first words at line 546. From this incident, we can see the impacts reflected in the text of the Works and Days, which focuses on the mortal realm. Refracted, in a sense, the description of the stolen fire occurs at line 50, the Pandora incident occurs at line 81, and the seasons emerge at line 398. As Butler has observed, there is a hidden connection between the dividing of the sacrifice, the stealing of fire, and the Pandora gift, that all react in an interrelated manner. At line 398, we see that time allotment is apportioned and divided, along with the portion preserved for the human being, since, quoting Carmen Romano, quote, after the Pleiades' first appearance, the next hint of the gods' naturalization comes at line 398, when Hesiod advises Perseus to, quote, work the work which the gods marked out to humans, using the verb diatekmairomai, the very same term West notes used of the seasons elsewhere in the Works and Days. Therefore, rather than opposing the order of Zeus, Prometheus is facilitating the new dispensation to bring humanity within the justice of the king of the gods. Another reason why Prometheus is not the rebel that he is often portrayed as is the fact that he did not technically steal the fire. Once again, he is demonstrating that he, whether wittingly or unwittingly, is ensuring that the world proceeds in cosmogenesis to its ultimate telos. Once again, let us return to Damascius' lectures on the Philebus. Quote, the fire that Prometheus stole and gave to man is elevatory existence and elevatory perfection, not viewed in its upward motion, but in the process of being distributed through him to the lowest stratum of the universe. This is why it is said to be stolen, because though elevatory, it is brought down, and through him, because only its descent is affected by titanic powers, while its existence as form is due to other gods. Later in the 6th century AD, Olympiodorus further clarifies what happened with the alleged theft of fire by Prometheus. Quote, what is stolen is removed from its own sphere to a foreign one. So since the rational soul is sent here from on high, its own sphere, virtually a foreign place, that is the reason why fire is said to have been stolen, since it was necessary for it to be brought down. The myth presents what is appropriate to the characters, and it presents the stronger, i.e. Zeus, as unwilling, for he wanted it to remain on high, and it makes the weaker drag it down here. As Butler makes clear, and this is absolutely imperative to understand, the theft, like the trickery, is to be understood as characterizing the object itself and not the gods. Although Prometheus has also been seen as the bringer of fire and technological innovation, it is important to note that the god that is closest to the human condition, Hermes, is also seen as providing a gift to humanity of fire and techne, as we can see in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, line 107, quote, "And intent on the skill of making fire he fetched a lot of wood. A fine branch of laurel he took and peeled of his knife, tight fitted in his palm, and up went the heated smoke. Hermes was the first to give us fire from fire sticks. He gathered many dry sticks and made a thick and sturdy pile in a sunken pit, and the flames shone afar, giving off a blast as the fire burnt high. While the power of glorious Hephaestus kindled the fire, he dragged out to the door close by the fire 2 curved, horned, bellowing cows. Indeed, great was his strength. They puffed as he cast them both on their backs, and bending their necks, he rolled them over and pierced their spines." A few lines later, he divides the sacrifice, quote, into 12 portions given by lot, and to each he assigned perfect honor. In the Homeric hymn to Hermes, we are seeing the god acting in a complementary role to Prometheus, and showing us how to sacrifice, and how to harness the fire that was, and continually is brought forth from Olympus to mortal hearths, and therefore how to return that fire back to the gods and re-establish a bond of kinship with the gods at the feast together. Under the section of the Damascus Lectures on the Philebus entitled The Promethean Method of Division, which appropriately enough precedes the section entitled Unity and Plurality Linked by Division, he says, quote, "According to Proclus, it is the method of division which Socrates describes as a gift of the gods. Therefore Prometheus, rather than opposing the gods, is actually acting as the conduit by which we can come into the embrace of the gods and dine with them when the portions are divided. For even Socratic philosophy and the other ologies of which we investigate the nature of reality are precisely of the same type of division. Hence it is called the Promethean method. Philosophy is itself a continuation in our day-to-day activities that replicates the division enacted by Zeus and Prometheus. Every instance of division, analysis, definition, and deduction is, in fact, a manifestation of the activity of Prometheus himself. As we mentioned in our previous video, Eumaeus' sacrifice for the disguised Odysseus is emblematic of all sacrifices that are concerned with the relationship between parts and wholes, exactly like the Promethean method. We have gone on at some length, and surely there is a density of material here, but I hope we have covered enough to call into question the project of Prometheism itself. In summary, Prometheus is only the outward exoteric manifestation of rebelliousness, but esoterically speaking, he in fact serves the cosmogenesis that results in Zeus's reign, and through his division, he has at once separated us from our previously close connection with the gods, but also simultaneously established a hierarchical relationship with them, where the path to commune with them in the feast is shown again once more, allowing for reciprocal obligations between gods and humans. Glory to Zeus and honors to all the gods, for it is good to dine at the table of the immortals once again. Take care for now.